course, in addition to debugging from the pod, you also want to debug the cluster components directly using Kubectl, right? And Kubectl is a very powerful tool, but when you have hundreds of services, pods, deployments, config maps, and a bunch of other components, it may be difficult to extract the information about the cluster components in a digestible way. So basically in a way that doesn't require you to scroll through endless lines of output about different components. For example, if you wanted to print out the node IP addresses of the pods or service accounts that pods are using, or maybe a creation time, image names, container names of the pod, you can't print all of these for all the pods in your cluster directly using Kubectl command. You will actually have to do Kubectl describe for each pod separately to see all this information. But there is a way to do this using a JSON path output format of Kubectl. Till now, you have learned that if we do Kubectl get pod, simply do Kubectl get pod, for example, you'll get a nice table view of the pod's most important data, like the name, status, etc. You also learned that with an output format of wide, you get a little bit more data about like the pod's IP address, the node name where it's scheduled on, and so on. And finally, you also learned that we have a YAML output format for the pods that basically gives you pod configuration in a Kubernetes native way in YAML format. As an alternative, we also have an output format in JSON. So if we do Kubectl get pod with output JSON, you will see the same details as we saw with YAML configuration, but in a JSON format. And of course, you can do that on all the components like nodes, services, etc. But just like with YAML, this is actually a lot of data to scroll through, especially if we have 100 pods. This will be JSON data for 100 pods. So how can we filter through all of this? How can we basically pinpoint and say, only give me the operating system image of every pod running in the cluster? Or how do you say, only show me the memory capacity of each pod in this namespace? So basically, how do we extract only specific attributes that we're interested in instead of having this huge YAML object for each pod? And for that, we can use something called JSON path, which basically is a query language for JSON. And Kubectl happens to have support for JSON path queries. So with JSON path expressions, we can query any relevant specific data from this whole huge output for each pod. So let's see how that works. So first of all, the output format here is, instead of JSON, it's going to be JSON path. And the way we specify expressions of JSON path is in quotes and curly braces. Now, JSON path expressions are not super easy and intuitive. They can actually get pretty complex, so it may take some time to get used to it. But you can do some very useful querying with that. So let's start with the simplest example where we just print out the names of all the pods in the default namespace. And the way we put together the JSON path expression is basically just finding the attribute names and working our way all through this hierarchy. So right here at the beginning of this huge JSON object that contains the list of all the pods, we have this attribute called items. So that's basically the top of the hierarchy. Inside the items is an array, and inside that array we have objects for each pod. And in that object we have attributes like API version, kind, and metadata. And metadata is the one that contains the name of the pod. So basically, this way we can work through the whole hierarchy to find the attribute that we're looking for. So we have to chain all this together. So again, going back here, we first start with dot items, and this will give us all the items, which is an array. From that array, we can get the first element like this. This will be just one pod. So as you see, this is a very ugly output of JSON configuration of one single pod. And from that pod, we want the metadata attribute. Let's see that first, getting a little bit smaller. And in the metadata, we have a bunch of this stuff, but we only want to know the name. And metadata.name will give us the name of the pod. So this basically ended up being our first expression that gives us the name of the first pod in the list. But we want to print out names of all the pods. For that, we just do star, which means for every item in the array, give me .metadata.name value and execute. And this is a list of all the pod names. Now, as you see, we have the output in one single line, which is not very nice. So using JSON path expression, we can also print the values on a new line. And let's see how that works. In JSON path, we also have a couple of built-in functions. One of them is range, which basically lets us iterate through the items. And for each item, print out the metadata name and add a new line here, and then end the whole expression. Again, this is probably not very intuitive, and you'll have to learn how to iterate through arrays, for example, but it will help you get specific output that you're interested in. So let's execute this, and as you see, you get the values in a nice list. Now let's say we want multiple values, not just pod names, but also pod IPs next to the names. So how can we do that? Well, it's pretty simple actually. After the .metadata.name, we can create a space or a tab like this, and then extract the IP address from .status.podIP of each item. So here we have the name from the metadata section, and the pod IP is actually defined in the status section of the item. So status and metadata are on the same level, and this will actually give us pod name and its IP address next to each other. And this way you can specify any other attribute you want to extract from this configuration. And let's do one more, again, separated by tab. And let's get the start time, or when the pod was started, which is also in the status section, and called start time. And there you go. So now we have a list of all the pods with their names, IP address, and when it was started. Now, as I said, the JSON path expressions are not very easy, and you may not want to type that often. So one useful thing could be to write custom scripts with JSON path expressions for Kubectl to print out some of the most common data that developers or you as an admin may need when working with the cluster. So you can have these pre-configured and ready to go expressions whenever you need them. So for example, we could save the above in a script called pod name IP created at .sh like this, and make it executable. And whenever you execute it, you basically have the same output. So this could be a useful way to use the JSON path expressions without having to type them all the time. And you can distribute the scripts to your developers as well. Now, if you have such scripts that give you an output of different data, it may not always be clear what this data actually represent. So could be a name of the pod, or it could be a name of the service, or what these IP addresses belong to, or what this date is about. So it will be actually useful to have some kind of column names for all these data, right? So can we add column names to these values? We can actually do that using another output format type called custom columns, which is simpler to use than the JSON path actually, and this may also be very useful in debugging. So let's see how that works. Let's use same kubectl get pod command, and instead of JSON path, we're gonna have custom columns output type. And the syntax is actually pretty straightforward. We have the name of the column. Let's call it pod name, and this can be uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter. I'm just gonna use uppercase and underscore separation. After the name, you have colon, and then you have to define which values will be grouped under this column name. And in our case, that's gonna be metadata.name. Note here that I don't have to use items. I can just grab the .metadata.name directly, and we separate the rest of the columns with their values using a comma. So the second column will be pod IP, colon, status, pod IP as we saw. And finally, let's call the third column created at, and the value is going to be .status.start time. And note that you shouldn't have spaces between the comma here. It should look exactly like this. And if I execute, you have a super nice output with column name, with the values under it. So it's much more descriptive and obvious what these values actually represent. So these were some of the useful ways of debugging in a cluster and maybe working a little bit more efficiently when trying to find information about different cluster components.